Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Georgie. I work at IHS Market as a project manager, and I've been working with E2W for almost a year now on their Champions of Diversity stream with the Alpha Challengers. So this is our third episode. I'm so excited. We've got a brilliant panel and we're going to focus on male allyship. So to get us started, I'm going to hand over to Nolly to introduce herself, who's also co-hosting with me today, and then we'll go around and introduce the panel.
Good evening, everyone. I see a lot of new faces and some familiar ones. Great to see everyone and to have your support today. So I'm Nolly and I'm part of the Alpha Challengers for E2W, and I work in the diversity stream alongside Georgie and Sarah, who unfortunately can't be here today. For my day job, I work in risk, operational risk for a fund manager that is based in Essex, and that's it about me. I'll pass it over to you, Georgie, to introduce our panel as well.
Okay, so yeah, we'll just go around, and if all our panelists could say who they are and how they link to male allyship. So Gary, will put you on the spot first. Go ahead.
Thanks, Georgie. So yes, hello everyone. My name is Gary Ford. My background is financial services and IT. And up until February, I was a managing director at JP Chase, large US financial services company. And somewhat bizarrely, I left in February to set up my own business when it was the worst time in business history to set up your own business. But I think maybe my connection to this subject probably is threefold. Number one of the more interesting things I did whilst I was at JP Morgan is I co-founded their Male Allies program for women in technology. As I'm sure many of you realize, technology has a particular challenge when it comes to gender equality. Secondly, I have recently become the Male Ally Advisor to Women on the Wharf. So that's a network of network groups. So all the firms in Canary Wharf, all their women's groups joining forces to discuss a number of kind of best practices in this area. And then finally, I am now the co-founder of Male Allies for Gender Equality. That's a new LinkedIn group. We had our first event today. So if people would like to follow us, that would be awesome as well. But obviously this is a subject I'm very passionate about and keen to discuss with others.
Brilliant, thank you. And do share the link to the LinkedIn page in this chat as well, so everybody can go and follow. Okay, so Michael, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Michael Cole-Fontaine, 40 years in financial services. I retired as chair of the Bank of New York Mellon, Europe, Middle East and Africa at the end of 2017, and have since been pursuing a portfolio career. I chair the Association for Financial Markets in Europe, a UK bank called Brown Shipley, and the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. And importantly for this meeting, I am also a patron for women in banking and finance. And already through these introductions, Gary has suggested connections, and Gary and I can do lots together to help make the world a better place, the world of finance a better place, at least for women.
Brilliant, thank you. Then we'll go to Hannah and Kevin after that, please.
So good evening, actually, everybody. My name is Hannah Cotton. I'm most prominent in this space following a TED Talk. 40 years being a woman, not so much with financial services, but I've done a TED Talk called Killer Stereotypes, and it's about how gender stereotypes actually impact everybody and offers some solutions to try and address them. I'm particularly keen on understanding male inequality, as whilst we continue to understand female inequality, but I genuinely believe that we have to work together. I've worked with Sunlam International, Barclays, supported by UN Women, and I've featured on the BBC. So I'm really, really happy to use a female voice to support this conversation as well.
Hi there, everyone. Good evening. My name's Kevin Brown. And my background is financial services as well, 35 years with Royal Bank of Scotland. I escaped there in 2014, mainly because I was doing 3 jobs. I was running their payments business globally, their transaction banking business globally, and also their fund management business in Europe, and decided that I needed to change the way I lived. Like Michael, I've been doing a portfolio since then, a range of different things, chairman of a Luxembourg fund company, but also I sit on the disciplinary committee for the FCA and for the payment systems regulator. I'm an independent on the board at the Bank of England, and sit on the risk committee for the high value payment system as well. I came to the Male Allies a little bit later, sort of 2 or 3 years ago, in the sense that they're putting a name to it. I was approached by the European Women's Payment Network to become a Male Ally as they were setting up, on the basis that I'd spoken out a number of times on the topic of diversity, particularly at conferences. So very pleased to be here and share some of my views.
Thank you. And as you can all see, we've got a great panel this evening, and Mark is also going to be on our panel. So Mark, do you want to introduce yourself for those who don't know, and then also set the scene on why it's important to become a Male Ally? And you're on mute, just as a heads up.
Georgie, thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us here today. Yeah, I set up E2W with my wife Tina 20 years ago, when we came to the realization that our financial services careers, being the type of husband and wife we wanted to be and the type of parents we wanted to be, were completely out of balance. So we established E2W, and for the last 20 years we've really focused on helping and supporting women in their financial services careers, and addressing the gender imbalance in the industry. Last year, through our network, we helped and supported around about 800 women to progress in their careers, return to their careers, and have championed them and been outspoken. This topic of male allies I think is really important. I see and hear a lot of men talking about they're doing this for their daughters, or it's the right thing to do. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But for me, it's much, much more than that. Study after study has proven the economic benefits of more diversity and inclusiveness. Study after study has shown that society, people, are happier in a diverse and inclusive environment. So, you know, through the campaigning that women have done for, you know, over 100 years now, the average man has got more opportunity than he's ever had. He's got more choice than he's ever had. He's more successful than he's ever been. He's happier and he's more prosperous. So it's an important topic for men as well. But we're not dealing with a level playing field here. Clearly, in the work environment, in financial services, you know, less than 20% of the top earning jobs are held by women. That's an awful imbalance, and shows just how far we've got to go. But let's not forget also the other side, the domestic gap. You know, more men now want to be active fathers. They want to participate in things that are going on in the home, and they want a partner as a wife, not somebody who's just a homekeeper. So there's a lot more to be done and a lot of choice to be had. And women need our help and support in the workplace, which is what being a male ally is about, and why it's so important.
Yeah, no, completely agree, Mark. Thank you. And I guess to continue on the conversation, Gary, what do you think is the business case for gender equality? I know Mark touched on it then. So what's the business case and why should it matter to men?
Yeah, always a great question, and I think Mark's began to touch on, you know, the amount of research that shows what good business sense it makes from a purely financial perspective. I always use the McKinsey example, where it shows, you know, companies with more diverse senior leadership teams on average make a 15% better return than other organizations in their sector. But it's more than just about the finances. You know, there's all sorts of studies that show you get much greater levels of innovation within your organization. The National Centre for Women in IT showed that, you know, you get 26% higher citation rates of software patents when they're submitted by a gender balanced team. You design better products, and you design products that customers want. If you take the launch of the Apple Watch back in 2014, it was seen as a, you know, designed by men for men product, despite the fact that subsequently we've seen that women are far more likely to be the buyers of those types of devices. You see health and safety issues all the time with bad product design. It happened with airbags when they were first introduced. They killed lots of women and children because they've been designed for men. You still see it. I don't know if you all remember the PPE when it was first put onto the front line for the NHS back in March. It was, you know, it was designed for men, and it, you know, wouldn't fit the women that were at the front line in the health service. And then you marry that, and I think Mark touched on this as well, with the increased level of staff motivation you see when people feel they're working in an inclusive environment. It's estimated by CEB Global to be something between 1.25 to 1.5 times greater, you know, staff motivation, engagement with their company, discretionary effort. And finally, I think customers and businesses are expecting it from the people they do business with. You know, they look for it in the people that, you know, that they want to go into partnership. They look for the signs that they're working with a diverse organization. And then finally, and really, I think for my sector, for technology, this is really quite frightening. If you begin to think about how artificial intelligence is beginning to replace human decision-making, and it's doing that on some really, really poor structured data with all the horrible biases that have been built up over generations. And we're beginning to see some really poor impacts of that. So I think the technology sector in particular have to really focus in on this, because it is the difference between them being successful and not being successful. And there's a couple of examples, and I'm sure people are familiar with this. Last year, maybe 2 years ago, Goldman Sachs released their Apple Card. And there was a husband and wife who applied for an Apple Card, and they both had exactly identical credit ratings. And the man got a significantly higher credit balance than the woman, despite the fact that, and they ended up suing Goldman Sachs over it, right? And another recent example, Microsoft withdrew their facial recognition software from all US police forces because it was regularly identifying the wrong person committing a crime. So as you can begin to see some of the AI decision making, and like, you know, so many potential human decisions are going to be replaced over the next 5-10 years. And if we don't get the data right, if we don't get the right people looking at that data, then there's going to be a lot of challenges for business, I think.
Yeah, some amazing stats. Well, Paul starts, but thank you for telling us. But I hadn't thought about the AI angle at all, so that was really interesting. Thank you.
I'd like to flag as well, if it's all right, 77% of the healthcare workforce are female. It's frightening when you actually think about who's been tackling COVID on the front line. Predominantly female carers have had significant amounts of face-to-face time with the viral load, not having the right PPE at a point in this pandemic is really, really important. But I would definitely want to touch as well as the business benefits to the organisation, the benefits to the individual in terms of having strong mental health and feeling included as a man, I would counter is as important as it is for a woman to feel included. So, for example, if we were to look at gender inequality and the very, very negative light, I'm a survivor of a very serious sexual assault and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which significantly impacted my ability to work. But with the right help, I was able to improve and actually excel. And that was thanks to my organisation's expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder. But then when you look at violent actions, which are predominantly conducted by men, There are also significant emotional reasons why men are violent. So I believe that actually, if we can really understand an individual, if we can take away the pressures and allow them to be free to be themselves, removing the triggers to react in ways which may lead to violence or alcohol dependency, drug dependency, and sadly, looking at the suicide statistics, I genuinely believe that both women and men will prosper when we can all feel as though we're 100% included.
Yeah, Hannah, I completely agree, and thank you so much for sharing that. Michael, I know that you also spoke to the mental health aspects, but do you have any other reasons why, what's in it for me to become a male ally? So why should men be male allies?
Well, I've had the privilege of being part of or leading high-performing teams, and in case we all hadn't noticed, there's a global war for great talent, and sometimes the blind spot or the bias is that you overlook great talent that's in your organization, or you overlook great talent when you're recruiting. And why would you not look at 100% of the workforce opportunity rather than just 50% of the workforce opportunity? So that there's a phenomenal business case for hugely talented women who are often underappreciated, underrepresented. And so if you can improve your organization in so many ways by hiring great talent and being open to the talent being able to come, but create an organization where that talent will flourish and bring its authentic best self to work and feel very comfortable and included in that environment, it's a much more enjoyable environment. And as Gary was saying, it's more innovative, more creative, it's better at managing risk. You have probably significantly higher levels of client engagement. And in the financial and professional services world, it's all about the client and serving the client. And if you don't look like your client or you don't speak your client's language, then you don't improve your probability of winning business, let alone retaining business. So I think that's what's in it for me in a business sense. And then it's the right thing to do. Simple as that.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. Now, I would like to pose the next question to you, Kevin, directly. Do you feel that to be a male ally, you need to have a women's network in the workplace? I know you mentioned before you were an ally before actually having that label of being an ally. Could you just expand a bit on that, please?
Yeah, certainly. And I know from our sort of previous discussions, I mean, this was something that was on my mind in terms of the questions that we were asking ourselves in the preparation for this panel. I mean, I think, you know, I didn't put a label on it until I was asked, I think. And I find that quite interesting. But then, you know, looking back, you know, I think behaviorally, I think there are many attributes that mean, you know, you can quite comfortably be a male ally without the need for, you know, that framework and that naming around it in terms of the way you act and the way you lead. And as Michael said, I mean, like Michael, I mean, I've always been a great believer in having diverse management teams. And I don't just mean by gender, you know, across the board. You know, social background, etc., because I think that gives you a better outcome. And certainly where I've been working in, you know, particularly innovative areas and product design, having that input from a variety of different perspectives has always meant that you've developed a better product. But just going back to the specific question, I mean, I'm very pleased now. I can put on my LinkedIn profile that I'm a male ally. to a women's network. And I do everything I can to use that to visibly support and try and encourage others to follow suit. And the story there was, there was originally 6 of us, and we are continuing to multiply in terms of support for the EWPN. But I do remember the very first conference that we attended, and the 6 of us were there, and there were 250 women. And that felt very different to conferences that I'd ever been to before. It was challenging, and I readily admit there was at one point when the 6 of us were together in the middle. But I found it really, really interesting and refreshing in terms of the approach. But I do think a lot of this comes from events drive activities, and I said to you before, people realise off the back of events what's the right thing to do. And I mean, the example I used was when I was working for NatWest. This was many, many years ago. I had 2 women who wanted to work, but because they were managers and they wanted to work part-time, that was something in those days that the bank didn't encourage. Managers had to be full-time, they couldn't work part-time. And actually, I decided that these 2 women would be absolutely brilliant working for me in a leadership role in the team. They did 3 days a week each, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I got the equivalent of 2 full-time people, to be honest. But actually, that was the critical point that changed the bank's view as well, in terms of thinking about more senior people doing part-time roles.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Kevin. Mark, I'd like to pose that question to yourself as well. I know you work with quite a number of large organisations. Do you find it's easier for you to work with male allies when there is an existing women's network? Would you think there are pockets of men who are allies, but silent allies perhaps, and aren't as vocal or maybe visible in the workplace?
Thanks, Nolly. So I think it's interesting. Over recent years, and I've gone in and met large investment banks and asset managers and said to them, what are you doing about gender diversity? And quite often the answer is, we've set up a women's network. And I don't think that is the answer. It's part of an answer. But then also what you're seeing now is a proliferation of different affinity networks, LGBT, BAME, the list goes on. I do wonder when we're going to sit down and just say, listen, nobody here wants to work in an environment that's unfair, that gives certain people privileges over others because of their background, their colour, or their gender. And quite frankly, nobody wants to work in an environment like that. So it's about recognising that, and it's about people using their power and their privileges every day, every second of every day, to stand up and be a human, to be good. This is about being a good human. Inclusive environments need everyone, men and women, to respect, to build and develop the culture that is inclusive. And that's how we're going to succeed. And it's imperative that those people in power and with privilege recognise that and use it to the best effect. So I'd say, everybody, men and women out there in the audience, stand up and be a role model. Be counted, and we'll all benefit. We'll move. We'll get to these final few miles of our journey to an environment that we want to work in.
Thank you, Mark. That was really well said. I like that. Now,
Nolly,
Gary.
sorry, Nolly, can I just add one small point?
Of course, yeah.
Someone shared with me a really interesting statistic today. Funny enough, another male allies kind of discussion. And it was basically looking at companies who had deliberately targeted men to be engaged in this conversation versus those that hadn't, and not because they weren't necessarily interested, they hadn't done it yet. And for the companies that had deliberately engaged men, 90% of them said that they felt their diversity and inclusion programs were making a difference. For those that had yet to do it, only 30% of them felt that their diversity and inclusion programs were making a difference. So I think it's a really interesting point. And to the way, Kevin phrased it about whether there's a women's movement or not a women's movement, simply engaging on a broader level and engaging your whole workforce, it's been proven to make such a difference, I think.
Yeah. Just to pick up, sorry, Nolly, to cut
That's fine, go on.
But we've had a question come through in the chat, and Gary, it picks up on what you said, so engaging men. How do you encourage men to become an ally? What can we do to encourage that?
So let me start off with that one. I mean, I've talked to thousands of men on this subject, and I think there's two really important things in my mind. The first thing is you need to make it a dialogue. You need to make it a discussion, and you need to allow them to freely think about their own real thoughts on this subject. I don't know, I thought it was really interesting, the reports in the paper this week about a number of MPs refusing to take unconscious bias training and stuff like that. And I know that unconscious bias training can easily backfire. And the stuff we tried to do with men was to make it very much a discussion and basically say, look, you have been silent on this subject. We really want to hear what you think. Because if they don't think, if they do think, oh, it's positive discrimination, or, I haven't got a problem, it's not me, which is fairly frequently what you hear, you need to surface that. You need to begin to unpack that and begin to have that conversation. So I think, number one, you've got to allow them. You can't just, tell them what to do. You've got to ask them what their views are and, trying to engage them. And then the second thing, you've got to try and make it guilt-free. You've got to say to them, this is not about making you feel guilty. This is not because we've seen you do bad things. This is not remedial in any way. It's genuinely, you're the victim of your own cultural upbringing, like we all are. And some of your biases are probably invisible to you. So therefore it's just about trying to make that first dialogue very inclusive and not making them feel guilty.
Yeah. It's also about attending events like these, and just looking through the screens, there are quite a few men here. So a big shout out to you, whether you were compelled to come along, interested to come along, just by attending, you're demonstrating allyship, because you're hearing and experiencing an event that hopefully everyone leaves this and talks about and says we can make a difference. Sorry, Georgie, that's back to you.
Georgie, can I just also add, and I think it may be stating the obvious, but often people need to be approached and asked, and that starts that dialogue that Gary said. I mean, that's certainly what happened with me. I was approached and asked, and then the whole behaviours start to come back, and you look at what you do and how you do it. But it is that first step of having the discussion that often doesn't happen soon enough.
I think you've touched on something as part of this discussion. You've touched on a couple of important areas. So we've mentioned feeling guilty, and someone in the chat as well, Leslie, has actually said about fear. So I'll start with you, Gary, because I know you started the Male Allies Network where you worked. What are some of the barriers that you faced with that, and perhaps maybe getting other men to join in that conversation as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, it's not uncommon that you get men who want to avoid this subject because they're really worried that they're going to say the wrong thing, and they're no longer sure what's appropriate. So again, I think there's certainly something around trying to make this a safe environment. There's something about giving people, the feeling that there's an element of trust to this. and they can explore these things. And you've got to say to people, like, we're all uncomfortable having these types of conversations. You know, one of the most interesting interactions I witnessed on one of the first times we did a workshop was a man saying exactly that. I'm really uncomfortable having this conversation. And the women sat next to him said, well, just so you know, so am I, right? And he was like totally shocked. He's like, oh my God, I thought you women talked about this all the time. She's like, no, I find it a really difficult subject as well. And I think sometimes it's about trying to give people that space to acknowledge this is uncomfortable and it's difficult, and you will make mistakes. You know, I still make mistakes. You know, people tell me, for instance, I would call you all guys, right? I do it all the time, but apparently that is not a gender neutral term, right? So everyone still makes mistakes with this stuff. And I think sometimes you have to say to people, that's okay, right? You know, as long as people know how to give good feedback on when they do, and people know how to accept that feedback when they're called out and not get super defensive about it and stuff like that. So a lot of it's about a bit of trust and creating that safe environment, but just say to people, you will get this wrong still. You know, we all still get it wrong, you know, but that's okay. You know, you're here to learn. A lot of it's about learning. I think Michael pointed out there's a huge amount of education here because you're trying to undo so much conditioning you've had from when you were probably quite young.
I will put this out there as well. Do you think that there is, to the panel, for anyone to pick up, do you think as well that perhaps it's the way or the manner in which men are asked to be a part of the conversation? Do you think that there is a blind spot where perhaps as individuals or as organizations, we could perhaps change the way that we communicate the message or ask men to engage? And I'll throw that out there to any of the panel.
Thank you. Nolly, I'll pick that one up if I may. I know Hannah wants to come in afterwards. I totally agree with you. I think quite often, and we talked about Me Too earlier on, but then there's he for she. And for me, that personifies how men are often asked to get involved in this subject. It's, you know, strong man for weak woman. And I don't think that's the best way to get people engaged. And men need to realise and understand just over the last 20, 30 years since I started work, how the workplace has changed. When my children were born, there was no such thing as paternity leave. In fact, my boss took me down the pub before he let me go home. The only place I wanted to be was home. We've now got more flexible and agile working coming in. We're no longer, when I started work, I looked up and I didn't see anybody that looked like me. All of the senior management came from a certain background, a certain university, and I felt different. So this affects men as well, and the benefits of diversity are there for men as well. So we should be talking to them about get involved because it benefits you, it changes your life as well, and moves things forward for you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Hannah, did you want to pick up on that? Because Mark briefly mentioned you'd like to join the conversation. I know one of the major things that a lot of men are worried about is what's happened with the Me Too movement. So a lot of men have sort of become perhaps a bit more reluctant and a bit fearful about how to actually breach the subject. So did you want to talk a bit more about how you think that can be better managed as well? You're muted, Hannah.
So I think one of the first things that I'm desperate to say is that following my TED talk, it talks very openly about my sexual assault and the Me Too movement, my significant post-traumatic stress afterwards, but actually then how much support I took from women in order to stay productive and heal, but then how much male allies helped me as well. I felt like I'd had to take a stunt in my career, but luckily I had male allies to really make sure that gender-based violence didn't detract more than it should. So thank you, male allies. You are so valuable. Thank you so much. But one of the things that I hadn't anticipated from my TED talk, when it went live, was the amount of men who then approached me to thank me for my position, saying, don't see me as the victim. I have an incredible amount of strengths. They may be different to yours, but also these men opened up in a way that I was unprepared for. Their lived experiences I had never previously considered. And actually, for me, I wasn't trained to deal with such an amount of information. I had to then get help as well, because male allies can be allies to themselves. They can be allies to us, but I also would like to say that women can, I hope, recognise that, I think Mark and Michael have already said, and Gary, I think you've all mentioned it, we're all conditioned. There are similarities that we all have, is that we're born without these social systems being imposed upon us, but we are then all subsequently influenced by the societal systems. So actually, what had really hurt some men, I felt that I had been socialised better for. I can reach out to women far more easily. Women ask for help. They're able to go to the doctors more. They're far more likely to seek help rather than succumb to substance abuse or, I hate to say it, but suicide. But there is also this, so there is a very tangible benefit for us all to work together. But there was also a Me Too backlash, a significant backlash in my eyes that was quite frightening. I've taken down some notes here. So following the Me Too movement in 2017, it's been demonstrated that now 38% of middle management have admitted that they wouldn't have one-to-ones with women. They're nervous. And my optimistic heart says, this isn't because they will grope them or they fear they will grope them, but it's more a lack of confidence that they aren't behaving in ways that may be interpreted as sexist or misogynistic. And then it's an education thing. And as all the male allies here have said today, you need space to work through this. Just as, you know, so many people are talking about anti-racism at the moment. I see the process identical as anti-sexism. First of all, you need to know what it is to be sexist. You have to feel able to ask, was that wrong? Would it be wrong? And allow that person to be educated. We'll engage them first, then we'll educate them. Then we need to empower these people to redress any sexist behaviours that they may have unconsciously been demonstrating in order for us to all work collectively better together. And I think one of the other things that's really important to note is that even within our own women's circles, I genuinely feel there's a huge sisterhood. But it's not like that is automatic. There are 50% of the population that now see eye to eye. We all have different views on how to progress forward on these conversations, and they're all equally important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Hannah. Now, you spoke briefly about engagement. Kevin, if you're happy to take this one, could you just give us a few pointers about how you think someone, for example, who isn't already an ally can actually go about implementing allyship within the organisation?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, I mean, certainly, sitting on a board as I do, we look at a whole range of culture issues. And interestingly now, with my regulatory hat on, the regulator is looking much more at cultural challenges and cultural issues within firms. And I think you're going to see that as a theme going forward. So I think, one of the key things for me has always been, look at your induction and your induction programs and look at how you can start this from the beginning. Because I think, we've seen in the past, there are gaps in terms of the process, and you get a lot of middle managers, and Gary's made the point a couple of times, I think, where there are challenges. But I think if you start this at the beginning, it means that you start that culture coming through the organisation from day one. And I think firms that do that and do that very well are the ones that succeed going forward. Interesting, I just listening to the previous conversation, just a couple of points just picking up from that as well. One of the other things I found, just in terms of behaviour, I found that a lot of people, particularly men who were very supportive across the diversity spectrum, often were those that were engaged in a lot of extracurricular activities outside of their work. So they didn't just have work, they were involved in youth leadership, or they're involved in schools, etc. So I do think, one of the other challenges and one of the other tools people need to think about is how you give space for those other activities to take place, because they build into the individuals and they come back into their work environment, and that has real benefits across the board. And I think that's something that actually organisations have lost. If you go back probably 30 years, and particularly financial services organisations used to encourage actively people's engagement in the external, in the environment, their local environment, whether it was youth groups or otherwise. All of that stopped, and actually you lost that richness of support and understanding that came through working with different people from different diverse backgrounds. So for me, it starts at the beginning, board leadership, culture, and then a good induction program, and that starts to drive that forward.
Yeah, I completely agree, and really great point about the induction program as well. So same question going across to Gary then. So how would you go about implementing male allyship within an organisation from your experience?
Yeah, so Georgie, I think we've all touched on this idea of that there is a commitment here, and I think from a senior management perspective, I think that this commitment has to be realised, and it's not necessarily about money, but it's certainly about time. So you do need to set us up about time. This is not simple kind of a 1 hour unconscious bias training, you're done. It needs consistent repeated kind of discussion. And we talked about on the last call this idea, and it's interesting again back to the Conservative MP story about whether you make this mandatory or not. When you make any sort of education in this mandatory, and I feel lots of research shows you shouldn't, so you should probably resist that. But I think there's an interesting approach where you say to people, if the company genuinely believes in diversity and inclusion, then you set a bar that says everyone should engage in some level of education on this subject. And whatever you want to set that bar, 2 days, 5 days, 2 hours, whatever, you set a bar, and then you give them options around the way in which they spend their time. But there's an expectation that people spend their time, and they can come to events like this. As Michael pointed out, this is actually part of that learning experience. You go to a workshop, you do some online Harvard bias training, whatever it might be. The other thing I think is really important that we found is that we had to capture the genuine female experience of our own workforce. So we went and asked all our women, what was it like working in technology at JP Morgan? And they told us. So therefore, when you confront men with this, one of their immediate responses is that used to happen 10 years ago, it doesn't happen anymore. Oh, but it happens at other companies, it doesn't happen here. And you say, absolutely, here's the evidence, here's the video. Actually, some of the women agreed to be video telling their stories. So you have to capture that female experience and make it feel real. And the final thing I think is really important, and we've all touched on this, I think it needs to be business led. This is not something your D&I team can lead. It's not something your HR department can lead. It needs to be led by the business themselves. One of the best examples I saw is I spoke to someone who was the European sales head at Dell Technologies, and he said to me, I spend 2 days a month leading workshops on gender equality, because that's how important it is to me. And you need that kind of business leadership and accountability. Unfortunately, all the evidence shows that men will listen more to men on this subject than they will listen to women. So men absolutely have to step forward and lead the charge with this particular, male engagement piece.
Yeah, brilliant points there. And I hope people on the call that are looking to implement a male allyship program take some great comments from there. So thank you, Gary. So a couple of questions have come in that have spoken to the current situation of COVID. So how do you think COVID has impacted gender diversity? Do you think that it has made it more balanced, or do you think it's driven more inequality? And I'll throw that out to anyone that would like to.
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Good. I think there are two sides to the coin here. I think absolutely a certain, first of all, we've got to look and not put people in too fewer buckets, women and men. Your COVID experience, Georgie, and we've spoken about this, has been very different from mine or some of the other women on the call today. People have had very, very different challenges in getting through lockdown, and it looks like we're going back there or nearly there again. Those experiences have been really very, very different. I've thoroughly enjoyed it against a difficult backdrop. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of women who have been homeschooling and trying to keep full-time jobs down. The other hand, I think, you know, from a male perspective, there are a lot of men, and this is being very generalistic again, there are a lot of men who for the first time in their careers have had the opportunity to throw a ball around at lunchtime, to go to the school gates, to not be on the 6:30 train in the morning and get back late at night, who have suddenly found this domestic life, and I know a lot of them have been and got involved in it and love it and don't want to go back. But that's all taking us up to where we are now. I think there's a big fear that going forward, post-COVID, we're going to get over this. We're going to get over, and we're going to move to some kind of new world that, if we're not careful, it could mean a death knell for diversity. That you get this two-speed workplace. You get the workplace of the people who are working at home and the people that are going into the office. And if we're not careful, that will tip the balance as far as diversity is concerned and inclusivity. And I think we need to train people and think very clearly, not just about getting people back into the office, but what our environment looks like going forward and how we make it inclusive.
Georgie, can I come in as well on this one?
Sure, yes, please.
This is it's certainly something that we've been talking about a lot on a couple of the boards that I've been on. Firstly, and really just picking up from Mark's point, I think one of the concerns for me is that, as you move to a more remote working world, which I think we will do, that does make the challenges of induction and the whole working together much harder. I've worked with different firms. Certainly one of the fintechs I'm working with, we've got employees across Europe and across the UK, and 90% have been working from home before COVID. And we've got quite slick at how we engage people through the technology and how we work together. But the other end of the spectrum is, and I won't name names, but some other organisations are really struggling with, they can work remotely, but they can't manage the interactions that they need to do to build the right training and approach and team working going forward. So I think I'm concerned a little. I'm also concerned that actually there's an age issue here, which we're already starting to see, where there is a desire for younger people to want to go back into the office and get back into that office environment. And actually that's not necessarily gender specific, it's male and female. So they want to be in there because they get that social contact and that interaction, where you've got older people who perhaps are in a different position, or as Mark said and Gary said, people are quite comfortable working from home and have already got established relationships that they can still manage remotely. So I think it's going to be a very interesting time. I think firms are going to have to work a lot harder to take some of the skill sets and knowledge into a remote working world, to make sure that they can still build those skills and teams within their organisation.
Can I please add to that, Kevin? I think you and Mark have said everything that I would have wanted to say. The only thing that I would want to put in there as well is about the unpaid and the emotional labour that it's now being evidenced is still falling to women. So again, it's so good. I love to see that men are embracing this being at home. But for the male allies here, please, when you're advocating for your female co-workers, we're still doing all the cooking and the cleaning, or significantly more of it, and that is a huge strain on our careers. When we feel we must always be looking after the children, we must always be responsible for keeping the house nice and clean. It would be so lovely for you to help at home as much as in the workplace.
I'd like to add one more other point about COVID, and I think that there is pros and cons of the impact on diversity and inclusion. I think from what we see, I am secretly quite hopeful, actually, and my hope is borne out by one thing, and I think that it's this. I think, and I'm hoping that companies are beginning to recognise who in their teams are really good people managers, because they're able to maintain levels of motivation and levels of staff engagement, even though everyone's remote. And that takes skill, it takes practice, and it takes a more human approach to how they deal with people. And I'm kind of hopeful that in the end, companies will begin to realize who their really good managers are, because they've managed to do that through this crisis. So I think some of the behaviors you want within your leadership and within your management structures will naturally become more apparent during this time. That's my one big hope about what we're seeing. I do recognize, to what Kevin and Hannah were saying, there are lots of, and Mark as well, there are lots of other ups and downs with our current situation. That's my one great hope. That's the change, one change we might see.
I was just going to say on Hannah's point, I mean, it's quite interesting. As a grandfather now, I've got two grandchildren. One is 2 and one is 5 months. And I suspect I've changed more of their nappies and looked after them for a lot more over the last, since they were born, than I got time to spend with my own children, on the basis that, I care for them at least 1 or 2 days a week so that my daughter can go to work. So it's an interesting dynamic in terms of the change, but I'm loving it.
Thank you all so much. My apologies, I look a bit different because my internet went out, so I'm using my phone now. So thank you so much for your patience with that. We've got a couple more questions because we're kind of running out of time. But the question I want to pose now is to Hannah and Michael. Particularly, we've been speaking about having allies and how important that is. And this is only one portion of, as Michael put it the other day, inclusion and diversity. The struggle is with inclusion and diversity and inclusion is, when we focus on one area, it's quite simple and very easy to overlook certain other areas. So when we hold conversation about one particular area of diversity, in this instance, we're talking about male allies, how can we make these conversations more encompassing? It was a struggle even with our panel to find quite a lot of allies who are a bit more diverse as well in terms of ethnicity, in terms of different backgrounds. How do you think that as individuals and as organizations, when we're holding conversations regarding one area, we still remember intersectionality?
It's a really good point, and I think many organizations struggle with this, and indeed even allocate funding to employee resource groups, affiliate groups, business resource groups, however you're maturing them in your organization. And inevitably, the women's organization network is usually the biggest and gets the largest amount of money. And often to the detriment of the LGBT group or the mental health group and otherwise, where people may not feel comfortable being very public or affiliated with a network in such an obvious way and having to declare an affinity in order that that group gets the funding. We're all much more powerful when those intersectionalities are joined up, and you can combine a mental health talk with an LGBT gathering, or an LGBT gathering with a women's gathering, and simply put, it's a more effective use of organizational resources. And and I think, Nolly, as we were talking about this, you said, it's exhausting. I'm a black woman, so I have to belong to that affinity group. I'm a woman, so I belong to that affinity group. And if you are interested in the mental health subject, or you're returning military, or you are interested in another particular health issue, or you want to be with people of difference, whatever that means to you, then it's organizationally dysfunctional to have to join many different groups who are each sort of competing to grab the discretionary engagement that you have. I've talked enough. Hannah, go.
Well,
Thank you, Michael.
I would definitely say we need to put pound signs in front of all of this. Intersectionality, I think, across the world now is so very, very clear in the reaction to the anti-racism movement in this country since George Floyd's murder. And I would definitely implore anybody to translate effective anti-sexist methodologies and not have them be effective in anti-homophobic, anti-ableist, anti-racist strategies. The methodology is very, very clear. We are all different. We all have different strengths, and we all have different barriers to being who we want to be. Some of those are physical barriers, some of those are psychological barriers, some of them are financial, social capital, geographical. There are so many different things that once we understand what they are, we can work collectively to overcome them. So yeah, I would definitely implore, if you consider yourself a male ally, I would imagine you would also be an anti-racist, and you would also be anti-homophobic, and you would also be anti-ableist, because you value the power of difference. And that's where the power is. The power is in the money. We have to work. We have to work together. And selfishly, I want it to work quicker. And as long as we're segregated and we're not having the conversations about where there's the overlap, I really feel like we're being inefficient, and we're missing an incredible opportunity to focus on our end goal, which is inclusion, rather than the diversity. I think diversity without inclusion is a bit of a waste of time. And I think that, again, the pound signs will support that. If you're recruiting diversity, but they don't, diverse, whether it's women, disabled, vets, Black, Asian, minority ethnic, if you don't feel included, you're not going to stay, or you're not going to be your most productive self. So yeah, follow the money, be inclusive.
Completely agree. Thank you. Okay, so we are slightly 1 minute over time. So I just wanted to close up with going around all of the panelists and just asking you each, what if there was one thing that you could tell people on this call that's an actionable item, whether that be for an organisation, for a male ally, anybody, what would you want them to take away from this call? So Michael, I'm going to put you on the spot and go first.
I would say two things. Step up to your power and lead from where you are. You may not think of yourself as a leader, but you're in your group, lead by your behaviors. In your community, lead by your behaviors. In your family and in your amongst your friends. And I saw there was a question about recruiting. Where are the young allies? And it's a really, really good point. Focus on youth as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Gary, I saw you've been muted, so coming over to you.
I think the most important thing, the most important message I would give to anyone is get educated, learn. Right. This is about learning, and I would say to anyone that the 5 or 6 years now I've spent spending a lot of time on this subject has been one of the most rewarding parts of my career. I think I've learned loads, and I've enjoyed that learning. And I learn something new every time I have this conversation. So I think this is all about how you can learn to be a better person, certainly a better person in the office, a better manager, a better leader, a better coach, but hopefully a better human being. And there's just such an opportunity, and everyone can make time to learn. It's so important.
Brilliant, thank you. Kevin, please, for your closing.
Yeah, very similar really to Michael. I think lead by example. And I think I would focus on that early stage in terms of induction. So focus on the young, and for people that have got children, focus on both their sons and their daughters.
Yeah, completely agree. Thank you. Hannah, coming over to you.
So all the best ones have gone, but I would
sorry.
Slightly changing the words around. You've got to lead yourself before you can lead others. So that's number one. Lead, then listen. Definitely do a lot more listening than speaking, and learn. Educate yourself. So yes, Gary, you completely read my mind. Lead, listen, learn. It's okay.
No, perfect. And then Mark, please.
Thanks, Georgie. In my lifetime, we've come a really, really long way already. We're more successful as an economy. We're happier as a society. Everybody in the society has got more choice and more opportunity. We have, though, a few miles still to go. And the only way we're going to get there is if we get there together. So let's come together. Let's do it together. Let's travel there without delay or further diversion. And let's finish the journey hand in hand together.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Another great conversation. I know I've enjoyed the prep calls coming up to this, so thank you. That was wonderful. I'm going to open it up, actually. I know we've had a few questions and we're 5 minutes over time, but if anybody does have any questions in the audience, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Also, I'll give a few seconds. Maybe there aren't any. We've answered them all. So we did pick up on a few in the chat. Okay, Nolly, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we've touched on everything we've discussed. Just to reiterate what you said, it's been a lovely journey coming up to this event, talking to the panelists outside of the event today has been really amazing. I know I've taken a lot away from this. So, and to everyone who attended, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.